would be my preferred.
Welcome, everybody. For those who I haven't met, my name is Rabbi Mark Katz. I'm the rabbi here at Temple Ner Tamid. And before I say anything else, I want to give a big thank you to Carrie Shavat, who set tonight up. Because I'm a rabbi and it's my prerogative, I'm going to start with a story from the Talmud very quickly. So, one of my favorite stories in the whole Talmud is about two rabbis who are best friends and study partners. One is named Rabbi Yochanan and one is named Rabbi Reish Lakish. And one day, as they're studying, they end up with an argument, and Reish Lakish actually dies of a broken heart. And Yochanan is given the privilege of having a new study partner. And they bring him this young hotshot named Elazar ben Padat to be the guy who's going to study with him. And he sits down to learn, and they begin to study until no sooner than maybe 5-10 minutes later, Yochanan throws up his hands and says, I can't learn with this guy. I don't want him as my study partner anymore. And everybody runs in, and they wonder why the great Rabbi Yochanan couldn't work with Elazar ben Padat. He was smart, he was young, he was bright, he was charismatic. And Yochanan says, when I used to study with Reish Lakish, I would say something, and Reish Lakish would disagree with me. And then I would have an answer, and Reish Lakish would have a rebuttal. And over the course of time, our discourse got elevated. We both got smarter. Torah was brought into the world because we disagreed. How am I going to learn with a guy like Elazar ben Padat, which every single time that I say something, he tells me how smart I am and gives me 15 reasons why I'm right. I want to know why I'm right. I already know why I'm right. I want to see the holes in my logic. Good discourse, the pursuit of truth, honestly, the future of the American discourse will be found not in people who agree, but in places where there are tension. People with differing views, people who are willing to elevate the discourse together. And tonight we are so privileged to have Jay Johnson and Steve Schmidt here who will do just that. So just a word about who each of them are. So Jay Johnson, local celebrity, lives in Montclair, knows probably half of this room. Former Secretary of Homeland Security under Barack Obama, and in fact, under Carrie's suggestion, was the very first person that we contacted after the shooting in Pittsburgh to come here and to talk about anti-Semitism in the United States. He and Jim Axelrod were in conversation with one another. They elevated the discourse. They helped us understand the current moment and actually kicked off the series, the very first speaker ever in this series that we are having tonight. Steve Schmidt is not only a political commentator, he's not only one of the founders of the Lincoln Project, but he was one of the architects of the McCain campaign and a really important voice in the Bush and the Schwarzenegger campaigns as well. He's a central voice in 20th century Republican discourse and thought, and has much to say about the current state of the Republican Party. So tonight, each are going to talk not only about their own parties that they came from, their, let's say, parties of origin, but they're going to talk about what they see as the future of discourse in America, the places where we might come together, and the places where we differ. And so let's put our hands together for our two speakers tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for opening up the temple for this very important discussion about the state of today's American democracy. Thank you, Carrie, Where's Kerry? There he is. Like master organizer and planner. One of the reasons 9,000 people turned out for the No Kings rally in Montclair, right here. 9,000 people. So, Rabbi, I have to tell a story. It's about the ultimate conspiracy theorist. Thoroughly believes in every single possible conspiracy that exists. The conspiracy theorist dies, and he goes to heaven. And when he gets to heaven, he meets the Lord. And the Lord says to the conspiracy theorist, "My son, before I admit you, I will allow you to ask me one question, and I will give you the God's honest truth to that question." One question. And so the conspiracy theorist looks at the Lord and he says, "Who killed John F. Kennedy?" And the Lord says, "My son, John F. Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald on November 22nd, 1963, from the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository in Dallas, Texas. He acted alone." And the conspiracy theorist looks at the Lord and says, "Wow, this thing goes higher than I thought." I want to start off our discussion with my friend Steve Schmidt with two quotes that I think might be appropriate for this evening. One is from Thomas Paine, 1776. "For as in absolute governments the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king." Second quote from Martin Luther King, 1965, 60 years ago, before a mostly white audience in Atlanta, Georgia. "So often, as John Meacham says, history rhymes." This is what Dr. King said to an audience of mostly whites in Atlanta, Georgia in 1965. "These persons are often silent today because of fear. Fear of social, political, and economic reprisals. In the name of God, in the interest of human dignity, for the cause of democracy, these millions are called upon to gird their courage, to speak out, to offer leadership that is needed. History will have to recall that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and indifference of the good people. Our generation will have to repent, not only for the words and actions of the children of darkness, but also for the fears and apathy of the children of light." Our special guest tonight is the polar opposite of an apathetic person, an apathetic American who has remained silent. Steve Schmidt grew up in North Plainfield, New Jersey. Our neighbor. As you heard, he was involved in the campaign of George W. Bush, involved in the campaign of Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in California, and managed the campaign of Senator John McCain in 2008. Founder of the Lincoln Project. He's launching another project, which I'm sure he will talk to us about tonight. He's been portrayed in the movie Game Change by Woody Harrelson. There is a vaguely familiar physical resemblance there. And has his own Substack called The Warning, which you can listen to. I think he put out 14 separate messages on Saturday during the Army Day Parade, or whatever it was called. Steve, you and I were debate opponents last December at the Oxford Union in England. It's kind of fun to debate in the Oxford Union. I recruited Steve to be my debate opponent. You dress up in black tie, you have drinks with some of the smartest, brightest students in the world, you have dinner and drinks with some of these very bright students, you debate, you finish the debate, and you go back to drinking. And the debate proposition that night was the House believes that the American democracy is failing. Steve was for the proposition, I was against. It was a month after the election and a month before Donald Trump took office. And so I would like to open our discussion by asking Steve Schmidt how you would answer that question today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for having us here, and thank all of you for taking time to come out and participate in a civic discussion. And it's important that we talk about some really serious things. Tonight is the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. British forces crossed the Charles River, 2,400 strong. The rebels were upon the hills, and it was a bloodbath. 1,000 British troops were killed, and they had moved 1 kilometer at the cost of 1,000 lives. And so these days that we're in are momentous days. And they're momentous days of anniversary. June 14th is the birth of the United States Army, a continental army. And on June 15th, 250 years ago, 2 days ago, George Washington takes command of it. And later this year, the Navy will celebrate its 250th birthday, and then the United States Marine Corps. All of these institutions predating the existence of the country. Washington assuming command on July 3rd, and we begin a countdown then to the 250th anniversary of a Declaration of Independence that breaks the history of the world into an epoch that was before and after, that all men are created equal. And the story of the country is the story of the progress in the erasure of that gap, and it has not been an even line. Some of our greatest leaders have made grave mistakes. We should not engage in idolatry around our presidents and our senators and our governors. So we're going to talk, in the words of my old boss, John McCain, straight tonight. And so let's talk about democracy. One indication of its failure, a rot, is a foul emission. And that emission is anti-Semitism. And you can chart a democracy in danger by a rise in anti-Semitism. And so there was a man named Avner Less, who was a German who lost his country and his family to the Nazi Holocaust. And in 1961, as an Israeli policeman, he pulled every string that he could to make sure that none of his superiors knew that his family was killed in the Holocaust, so that he would have the assignment of interrogating Adolf Eichmann, which he did singularly and solely for 275 hours, and did not talk about it for 20 years. And so this man, in 1981, is asked a question about whether he had any takeaways from the experience. And his answer is, yes, it changed my perspective on everything regarding democracy. That there are Adolf Eichmanns everywhere. And they are harmless in a democracy, but they become deadly in an instant in a dictatorship of the left and the right. And we see no shortage of Adolf Eichmanns, little Eichmanns, gleams in their eyes. And so I had the privilege of going to Auschwitz for the 60th anniversary of the liberation of the camp. And again last March, and I was with one of the head guides of the camp. His name is Paul. He was a Polish journalist, radio correspondent, who now is the lead of the programs there. And we spent a day together, and we went to a quiet corner of the camp, and he said, people ask me, is it true that birds don't fly over Auschwitz? And as he said that, a stork took off from one of the pools in which the ashes of 1 million murdered Jews were dumped. And so you ponder the meaning of Auschwitz. And I can't say, having been there for 2 days, that I have been to Auschwitz. And at some level, even a survivor of Auschwitz cannot say that they have fully experienced Auschwitz, because only the people who walk down the stairs into the gas and their bodies into the ovens truly experienced Auschwitz. And so in this quiet corner of the camp, Paul looked at a building and he said, do you know what that building is? And I said, I do know what type of building that is. It's a sewage treatment facility. And it stood there in the ruins of gas chambers 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, blown apart, but there are remnants there, and you can see where the evil has taken place. But these buildings were perfectly intact. And he said, did you know that Auschwitz got off to a late start with the killing? Because they couldn't get the permits. And so the SS was not omnipotent. They had to bring in a plan that we're building a prison in the middle of the woods of Poland. And German bureaucrats said, well, what's your fire plan for the barracks that the Jews would be put into? And the water bureaucrat said, what's your plan for the wastewater treatment? And the SS said, well, we'll dump it in the river. And the water bureaucrat said, there's 5 million Germans downriver. It'll poison the water supply. 9. And the SS went back and applied again. 9. Third time's the charm, and he takes out the piece of paper with the stamp of the Nazi bureaucrat that opened Auschwitz. But that's the story of how Auschwitz opened, with a stamp from a water bureaucrat demanding a wastewater treatment facility. And so we have to understand, we're going to talk about time tonight, and the journey of 10 years' time from when Trump came down the elevator, where we were to where we are. But there are many lessons to be learned from history, and one of them is to see clearly what is unfolding before our eyes. And we'll talk honestly about that. But democracy, is it in trouble? Is it in crisis? It's under a grave threat from within that's real, that's tangible, that's definable, and has said at the highest level that they intend to use the full force of the military and the 3-letter government agencies to liberate the cities and the states from the people who dissent against them. And this, my friends, is an intolerable proposition, and we must oppose it.
Steve, you remind me of when Susan and I visited Auschwitz, 2014. The images that have been stuck in my head are the eyeglasses and the locks of hair piled up. And I remember looking at this thinking, this is the evil and the depravity that the human race is capable of. And there's no reason to believe that impulse doesn't exist anymore. This is what the human race is capable of, if let loose. Let me ask you this. You grew up in New Jersey. You became a Republican. You supported Republican candidates for office. What brought you to the Republican Party?
Well, I was, my parents grew up in Bayonne and Jersey City. So in Bayonne and Jersey City, as my dad tells it, there wasn't a single registered Republican in the county whatsoever. My grandfather was a bus driver in Jersey City. My parents moved out to North Plainfield. My dad worked for the phone company. My mom was a teacher. They were 33 and just moved out of the city in the walk-up apartment in Jersey City to the suburbs. And they had 2 little kids, and they were the quintessential Reagan Democratic voter. Christy Whitman, Republicans, Tom Kean, Republicans. My dad, in retirement from the phone company, he ended his career restoring phone service on the Ground Zero site and is, I think, disabled from that experience. But he becomes the deputy majority leader of New Hampshire. I gave a speech in favor of gay marriage 3 years before Barack Obama was in favor of gay marriage, and was part of a tradition of moderate republicanism that existed in a country where there were conservative Democrats and there were liberal Republicans. And there were Democrats who were to the right of a lot of Republicans and Republicans to the left of Democrats. And that was the case in states like New Jersey, where the Republican Party was really a good government party, is that you would have a period where the Democrats were in there for a decade, 12 years, and Republican would be put in, whether it was Tom Kean against Jim Florio or, and Christy Whitman against Jim Florio. They both beat the same person. And so, that era of the 1980s, I was a child of the 1980s. I turned 10 years old in 1980. I remember the Olympic hockey game, the Iranian hostage crisis, that entire period. And culturally, we were going back to Vietnam. We had Rambo, and we had Chuck Norris, and we had all of that. And I came through college. And by the time I was a freshman in college at the University of Delaware, in the freshman dormitory, if you were an 18-year-old in 1988 and you said, "I'm from Michael Dukakis," people would have looked at you like you had a horn on your head, right? And so different time, different place. I've voted for a fair number of Democrats for president over my career. I voted for Clinton in '96. I voted for Barack Obama in 2012, and I've always been.
But not 2008.
No, well, that's a different story. But you're going to the biography. But I do say when I do speaking around the country, that one thing that we all have our experiences in life. One of the experiences I had in life that matters in this moment, I was the very first person to congratulate Barack Obama, who was a Republican, to say these words: congratulations, Mr. President-elect, before I handed the phone to John McCain for the concession. So this is the cornerstone of our society, that we get to pick our leaders. And so the instant that Donald Trump said, well, I may concede the election, but only if I win, right? That was a cancer diagnosis in our democracy in that instant, in that moment. We've been in a crisis ever since that. In a two-party system, one of the parties opts out of a belief in elections, and one of the parties opts out in a belief in accepting the results of an election, we really want to have panel discussions on cable news about whether we're in a constitutional crisis? We're in a constitutional crisis, ladies and gentlemen.
Steve, you managed John McCain's campaign in 2008. You obviously spent a lot of time with him. Tell the audience something about John McCain that you think was the essence of John McCain, and what would he think of today's
He would not be
democracy?
happy.
To put it mildly.
I remember there was this, he would taunt the national media. He was irascible at some level, and we were in a dead even race against Mitt Romney in South Carolina that was going to determine the outcome of the election. And there were reporters as close to McCain as right here, all on the bus. And he gets a call from Ted Kennedy, who was a good buddy of his. And that's another person who would have no tolerance for what would be going on right now. But I remember John McCain talking to Ted Kennedy, and they're laughing and telling jokes within earshot of the reporters while all the right-wingers in the Republican Party are after John McCain. That's like the last thing we need is for the news to go out that you got Ted Kennedy on the phone here and in South Carolina, and don't ever do that again. But I'll tell you a story about John McCain. That people don't know really the full story of. Everybody is familiar with when he takes the microphone back from the woman who denounces Obama as a Muslim. So the crowds were getting angrier and angrier as it was becoming clearer that Obama was going to win. And the reality was the campaign was over the instant Lehman Brothers imploded and the economy went down. And Mark Salter, who wrote all of John McCain's books, was the co-author. We were standing at an event, and crowd is there, and McCain would engage, if for those of you who remember John McCain, in a little Borscht Belt humor. He had a package of about 10 to 15 jokes he would use. He would get up there, and McCain was not a natural campaigner, but he gave it his all, and he was always respectful. But he said the name, my opponent Barack Obama, and you hear N. And I look at Mark and I said, did you just hear that? And he says his name again, and you hear more people. And that was the first time in my adult life, and absolutely the first time in the 21st century, I heard that word spoken in anger. And so as we're rolling through that week, national press is hearing it, and they don't want to implicate John McCain for it because he's not inciting it, but we're having issues with Sarah Palin, who is growing more and more out of control, enamored by her fame and the likes and all of this. And it's my fate in life to be the person who tells everybody no in the McCain campaign. But John Lewis, who is a great hero of John McCain's, looks at these crowds and sees something, and he calls it out. And John McCain believed to his dying day that this was a great unfairness, that his hero had said that a John McCain crowd was filled with the type of people that John Lewis remembers staring back at him from the bridge. And the truth is, I had some enmity and animus towards John Lewis because I thought it was unfair in the time too. And we recognized John Lewis as a great moral hero, and we were hurt. And John McCain was hurt. And he writes about this in his last book, how devastating this was. And we have this conversation with John McCain and we say, John, Senator Obama is going to be the president. You know, the first black president. And we got to start preparing for the transition. And we got to run hard through the end because you have all these candidates down ballot. But if you say his name, you're going to provoke the word. And we can't control the racism of the person who shows up in a crowd of 35,000 people in any given venue. And so we can't say his name. Or we're purchasing the word. And John McCain understood that, but he said, well, what's the implication of that? I said, well, the implication, John, is the campaign's over. And John McCain understood that he would, in a short order of time, be standing in front of the nation and validating the victory of a 47-year-old man who was the first black man to be elected president of the United States in a nation chartered from the idea of all men are created equal. And so it's in that context that John McCain takes back that microphone from that woman in that moment of putting his country ahead of his interests, ahead of his politics. And what most people don't know about John McCain is that he was the chaplain of the prisoners in Vietnam. And the thing that was more important to him than anything else was reconciliation. And he was a leader with Bill Clinton and John Kerry in reconciling our relationship as a nation with Vietnam. And he was a man who could have fantastic feuds and fights, but then great reconciliations. And I'm going to tell you a story a little bit later about one of those American reconciliations from our history that matters in this moment. But he was an exceptional patriot who literally spent every single hour of his adult life, save 6 months, in service to the United States. He was an honorable man.
Steve, I remember being on the receiving end of John McCain's temper from time to time when I was in office, but then 10 minutes later, it would be all fine. So you brought her up. I have to ask, why did John McCain pick Sarah Palin as his running mate?
Well, he wanted to pick Joe Lieberman, and that's what I had said to him, that I thought the only way that he could win was if he took a one-term pledge and basically went out there and said that I really admire Senator Obama, but he's not ready to be president yet. I think he's going to be president one day, but it's not time to pass the torch off. And I've asked a great friend of mine, a great Democrat, to join me to fix the country's 5 biggest problems before we hand it off to the next generation. And the choice the country will have is whether we give Senator Obama, a fine young man, some more experience in the Senate before he gets the keys to the nuclear weapons. And that was going to be basically the message, because there's only been a couple of instances where the incumbent president's party gets a 3rd term. And the economy was cratering, the war was failing, and it was an interesting campaign. And so when I took over the campaign, which I did functionally at 2 different times, once in the primary and once in the general, I was put in charge of everything except for the VP selection. And I didn't have a great reaction. We didn't have a terrific relationship. They made a movie about it. But John made a reckless.
Steve, the one line I remember from the movie, McCain is told, high risk but high reward.
We went for a walk with John McCain down by the river, and John McCain goes, "Steve, I want you to argue the case for Sarah Palin." And Mark, I want you to argue the case for Tim Pawlenty. And Cindy McCain was there, and I said, absolutely not. I said, it's high risk, high reward. You got to decide, is she ready to be president? Can she take the oath? And I hadn't spent any time with her at this point, and we all go around. Mark Salter says to him, there are worse things than losing an election, including your reputation. And Cindy McCain goes, John, it's a big gamble. And John McCain loved to gamble, right? The most pissed off he ever got at me was when I would not let him go to the floor of a casino in Vegas as the Republican nominee. And then I caught him trying to order a table and a private dealer to his suite, which I intercepted. And so John McCain pretended that he had craps dice in his hand, and he pretended to roll the dice, and he said, quote, fuck it, let's do it. And he did it, and he picked her, and she was an avatar of something that I think most commentators don't hit the nail on the head quite right on. But what she was at the core the first person who was totally seduced by the reality show culture, who left her job as governor of a state to be on a reality show, who was enamored of the Fox prayer warriors and all of the crowds and all of the likes, and somebody who really snapped under the pressure of the criticism and found solace in the extremism of this very fervent base that allowed her to opt out of reality. And it was the first time in my life I had a conversation with somebody, who I would have a documented piece of evidence, and I'd say, listen, your husband was registered as a member of this secessionist Alaska party that you lied about, and here's the paperwork. She'd look at it and be like, no. and I'm from New Jersey, so this didn't go well. Right? It didn't go well.
Okay.
Didn't go well.
So let's fast forward to 17 years later. Donald Trump is elected president in 2016. He's reelected president in 2024. You have been very, very outspoken about the state of our democracy, about the Trump presidency. What worries you, what animates you the most about the current state of our democracy today?
Well, I mean, you see what's happening in plain sight, and I could point out around a circle, and maybe that's the best and easiest way to think about it. But, everybody in this room owns a piece of America's public lands. And as somebody who lives in the American West and has for a long time, these public lands are magical, and you own them. Any inner city kid, any country kid, we all own them equally. It's unique in all the world, and they're being sold off. The forward momentum of scientific progress has been halted. We've reached an apogee, and it's falling back. We have a public health crisis. We have tariff madness, an economic crisis, masked federal agents, a federal occupation of an American city against the will of the local officials. We see the lying, the officiousness, and the profound corruption, and we see the consequences of a loss that gave the MAGA extremist control of the House and the Senate, which are functionally Politburos and rubber stamps, and they face and utterly feckless Democratic Party opposition. And that is something we have to talk about, because I lost as the strategist of a campaign to Barack Obama. They lost to Donald Trump twice. And we're out of time. So can't indulge the incompetence of Chuck Schumer and the Democratic leadership. It can't indulge the insanity of the identitarian dogma of the left wing of the Democratic Party. And the reality is that the American character is such that there's zero chance of there ever being a left-wing authoritarian movement that gets elected. The mere threat of the existence of the remotest possibility, though, is enough to create the conditions for an actual fascist government. And so, as has long been predicted, apocryphally attributed, when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross. And so that's what we see, and that's what we're dealing with, and the American people have to repudiate it at the ballot box in overwhelming numbers beyond the imagination of the technocrats and the bureaucrats of these election committees in Washington, who are out of touch with the country, out of touch with the people who live in the country, out of touch, out of touch, out of touch. And their out of touchness is now a danger to our liberties and our rights. And so this election is not about maintaining the leadership of any cohort of Democrats in Washington. It's about taking the first step to reform and renewal of the country, because we're going to have to exercise power to defang the presidency and defang these giant tech companies and defang the billionaire class that have waged war on our liberties and on the Constitution of the United States with a high-handedness and an arrogance that is beyond my ability to describe. And we're going to need to say enough and lay out an agenda that says this will never happen again in this country.
Steve, I want you to put on your political scientist hat for a moment here. We elected Donald Trump not once, but twice. And the second time, we knew what we were getting. So what's going on with the American electorate? What is stirring among the American people such that by a majority of the popular vote, we were willing to elect Donald Trump a second time?
Well, because Donald Trump, and it's going to be tough for some people to hear, and it's astonishing. But let's go back to 2016. And I'm going to hang a gold medal on the neck of the person right now, proverbially, who said the craziest thing in the entire campaign. And that person was Jeb Bush. And he was asked a question, and the question was, knowing then what we know now, would we have invaded Iraq again? And Jeb Bush said, yes, absolutely. World is much safer. And Donald Trump looked at him and said, you're nuts. Who was right? Trump was right. Who was honest? Trump was honest. And so Jeb Bush was asked a question that everyone in the audience already knew the answer to, which was, of course, we wouldn't do that again. But that wasn't really the question. The question was, will you tell the truth against your brother's interests? Will you put us first? So every Democrat's going to get a question about their complicity and the cover-up of Biden's condition, and they're getting in line, and the cowardice that led to the disaster? And we all know the answer. And the question will be whether they will tell us the truth so we can know whether they can stand up and have the strength to stand up against Trump. So when you see Gretchen Whitmer put the folder over her face, putting my kid's fate in your hands, not voting for you, unacceptable. And so we go through the list of candidates who can't speak with conviction and need 10 advisors. There's a scene in the book about Kamala Harris where she requires a dress rehearsal of staff before having a cocktail party with 20 people. They have to have a dress rehearsal of the cocktail party. And so enough. And this moment requires a clear understanding of something, which is this: the most prolific liar in American history, who told 35,000 lies, the American people looked at him and he said he's the honest candidate in the race. He's honest about Biden's condition. He's honest about the border. He's honest about the economy. And the Democrats shouted down anyone who told the truth about Biden. They said the economy was the best it's ever been or could be. And the cultural condescension that you'll use this pronoun, this word, policing the language, and turning a great political party into the HR department of an out-of-control company has given us Donald Trump. He's given us Donald Trump. The Democratic Party of John Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt was a party that talked about ordinary people. Franklin Roosevelt talked about the forgotten man. Lyndon Johnson talked about building a great society. We live at the turn of the first quarter of the 21st century in a time of crisis that requires new leadership. And there are new leaders. There are people like Jake Auchincloss in Congress. There are young leaders. And these leaders and all of us have an obligation to stand up against some things that we see going on out there that we know, that we understand, that we appreciate are deeply un-American and deeply wrong.
So does the Democratic Party double down on progressive values, or does the Democratic Party seek to appeal to the swing voter in Ohio or Michigan, or is it just simply a matter of authenticity?
I think if you have to have a consultant talk to you about authenticity, you have a problem, right? Like, it's like, if you have to spend $20 million, right, like studying—
Make me authentic,
right,
please, yeah.
Right, like studying men, right, it's a problem. And so what to do in this moment, to me, is very simple. I would like to share my identity with all of you tonight. I am an American, period. And I do not care about any other distinction beyond that. I believe in liberty, and I believe in freedom, and I believe in opportunity, and I believe in government of the people, by the people, for the people. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in the freedom of worship. I believe in the freedom of conscience and personal choice. And these things, these ideas, these concepts, they're deeply embedded in our national character. We have to find our way back to them as a matter of faith. We have to appreciate that the country has been forged in fire for 250 years, and that a momentum of events that has been building for a long time has taken us to this point. We had an attack on the World Trade Center. The president I worked for started a war under false pretenses in Iraq. 2 failed wars, a generation sent to fight them. Political leadership of the country has done profound moral injury to our veterans, many of whom suffer from physical injury while the VA gets cut. And we stand at the edge now of another war and an unfit leadership leading the military. And so politics became a province for people who were involved in politics and liked it because that was their hobby, and other people were on it and working at it, and so nobody had to pay attention to it. And now we all have to pay attention to it. It's just as simple as that, or there'll be a terrible consequence.
Rabbi, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. I believe you wanted to ask a few questions.
So one of the things I noticed over the past few days is that with this war between Iran and Israel, it's sometimes hard to figure out where exactly each of the parties falls. And it seems, by the way, that each of the parties is split, both of them. Now, this is something that...
You mean the political parties?
The political parties. It's something that we in our community, this war has been keeping us up over the past week and praying deeply, deeply. But those on the far left of the Democratic Party don't want to see America get involved. Those in the center feel a little bit ambivalent about it, but understand that Israel needs to do what it needs to do. Those on the right, you've got those on the far right. MAGA is split between those who want to see us involved and those who don't. I'm curious if you can, either of you, say a word about what is going on politically in America that's causing this interesting divide within each of the different parties. And secondly, what do you see as America's role in this?
So I'll start, and I'm sure Steve has views on this. Historically, the Democratic Party was pro-Israel. And October 7th fractured the Democratic Party largely along generational lines. In my experience in national security, homeland security, very few things are black and white. One thing that is black and white is terrorism, hatred in any form, particularly practiced against Jewish Americans, against Israelis, is unacceptable, inhumane, has to be denounced. But in national security, complex national security, homeland security problems, very few things are black and white. There are always different shades of gray. And the Middle East is people, as you know, have been working on peace in the Middle East for years, for generations. It's not a problem that can be solved overnight by just force of personality by a new president that just parachutes in and says, all right, everyone, let's have peace. It takes, ask Bill Clinton, ask Jimmy Carter. It takes hours, days, years to bring about peace in the Middle East. And one of the things that I find most striking about this country is I think the Jewish population in this country is 4%, but American Jews are the victims of something like 70% of the racist attacks in this country are targeted. So anti-Semitism in this country is real, it's viral, it's alive and well. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Jews stood with with blacks during the civil rights movement. When we moved to Dutchess County, New York, when I was 5, and I went to school, private school, all my parents' friends were Jewish. They were the ones that welcomed us into the community. And it was in the 1960s, it was a very natural alliance. And it breaks my heart to see that alliance fractured today. And so I think there's plenty of room for rebuilding a coalition of Americans that includes Jewish Americans and find the solution to peace in the Middle East.
So I think it's here's what's happened, and I'm going to try to answer the question through the prism of where things are at this moment before I walked out here, which is Israel. Netanyahu has ordered a preemptive attack on Iran going after the nuclear program. And so the end stage of the issue that has been at the front of foreign policy debates for 40 years, 25 years of nuclear negotiations is at its end stage. And so the Iranian attack either has to destroy the nuclear weapons program and the regime can survive. They don't have to destroy the regime if the program is gone. There are different issues, but Iran is badly weakened. Or they can topple the regime without fully destroying the program, but they cannot allow the regime to survive without destroying the program. And so if the regime survives, obviously now, after Netanyahu went for the head of the snake and missed, what will happen is the Iranians will race to getting a nuclear weapon. So one of the things that Donald Trump talked about at the desecration event at the 250th birthday of the Army was the absolute unconquerability of the American military, a superhero force that can go anywhere, smash any enemy. And when you listen to what he said, that's your takeaway from what's gone down the last 25 years with the use of the American military. And so right now, the only country in the world that has the planes and the weapons that can be dropped from those planes to obliterate the mountain under which the nuclear reactors are is the United States. So Trump, and I mean this from just my perspective with Pete Hegseth at his side, two imbeciles of the highest dimensions, have to take a military action in a divided country while they're making declarations of civil war against major American cities, and no one trusts a word they say or a word that Netanyahu says. And so that's where we are. And the question that Trump's going to have to face, and I think I know the answer to this by his tweets, and I don't disagree with the analysis, which is obviously the worst case situation is I do nothing, Bibi missed, and now they race to get a weapon, and anybody who says that's not a danger to the United States is completely nuts. So all of the idiocy, all of the incompetence has taken us to this moment where Trump has been cornered. been manipulated into having no choice, and there will be great rage in the far-right fascist wing of his MAGA movement against his taking military action, as there will be on the extreme left of the Democratic Party that hates Israel. And so it's a moment where you're about to see the United States take military action in Iran within 200 days of the peace president's inaugural. So Trump promised prosperity, we're going to get misery. He promised peace, we're going to get war. And the lesson of this, I think, will endure for a very long time. After the damage is done, the bill is totaled up, the lives lost are understood, and we renew the promise of the country, which we will have to do.
So on that note, let's talk anti-Semitism a little more. Anti-Semitism feels to me like one of the few bipartisan issues that are still around, unfortunately, right? There's anti-Semitism on the political left, anti-Semitism on the political right, and we feel it in both cases. I'm curious, it is really interesting actually to watch as those who are on the right in America point to those who are on the left and say their anti-Semitism is worse, right? And there's some pretty bad anti-Semitism on the left when people are walking around talking about globalizing the Intifada, right? Blaming all Jews for what happens in Israel, who denounce Zionism as racism, even as 90% of all Jews are Zionists, right? And at the same time, those on the left are pointing to the right and saying their version of anti-Semitism is worse, as those on the far right dance with Holocaust deniers and promote white supremacist ideology. And I'm curious if you can say a word about, for each of you, which anti-Semitism scares you more, and what is to be done about anti-Semitism in America right now?
Well, in my experience, a racist spirit, it does not belong anywhere on a particular political spectrum. And in my life experience, racism does not discriminate. A racist hates us all. And I think that anti-Semitism is alive and well in this country. It's viral, and it goes hand in hand with discrimination based on race. And it goes hand in hand with a lack of understanding of history. So when I hear people on the right invoke the phrase nationalism, white nationalism, I know what that conjures up because I have a sense of history, as do a lot of Jewish Americans know what that conjures up who have a sense of history. And so there's so much in common between discrimination based on race, discrimination based on religion that I've seen in my 67 years of life. And I don't believe it belongs on any, that evil belongs, nobody on the political spectrum has a monopoly on that.
I think that the two extremes are each other's supply and demand. And so the evil is equal and equally sinister. And whether you were a Jew killed by Stalin or a Jew killed by Hitler, you were still a Jew who was killed for being a Jew. And the anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the country that's coming out of the universities is novel, and it is a result of organization and ideology and propaganda. And so you see people talking about with signs that are ludicrous, because if they went as a transgender, left-handed, whatever, to Gaza, they would be killed immediately. And the truth is that the extremes are the place where we find the disease in our democracy. And wherever you find disease in democracy, you find anti-Semitism. And so what I urge all of you here tonight to do is, after tonight, if you've taken the time to come out, is go back and listen to the speech that Elie Wiesel delivered in the White House on the eve of the millennia, where very much it is a valedictory address of the 20th century, a summation of it. And he talks about indifference. And this is a moment where we cannot have indifference to what is happening in plain sight. And the anti-Semitism, the political violence, all of these things are going to get worse before they get better. And it's happening because we've been on this road and we've arrived at that place on this road. We did not take the exit as a society, and here we are. And so what this moment will require is an obstinacy on the part of the American people to say no, no. And that defiance, as it plays out over the summer, is going to, between today and the fall, take us a great distance together as a people. And we'll see where we are in the fall, but it will be quite different from where we are today in the intensity of the crisis. And when we get ready in November to be a year out from an election, understand the stakes in 2026, that we have to restore checks and balances and end the Politburo rubber stamp. And I don't care what party you're in. One-party dictator rule is one-party dictator rule, no matter what your party is. And I'm against dictators because I'm an American.
So I think we have time for just one final question. So I'm going to ask this question, and then I apologize for those who had questions maybe afterwards. I don't think you're running out. Maybe they can ask you individually. What gives you hope?
Hope is in my DNA. My grandfather was a sociologist in the South, middle of the last century, and he wrote an essay in the New York Times a month before he died in 1956, just on the eve of the Civil Rights movement, and he said, faith in the code of our nation and our democracy has always been greater than the impulse to despair. And I believe that as well. I also believe what Franklin Roosevelt said in his final inaugural address in 1945, that there are peaks and valleys, there are advances, there are setbacks, but civilization always has a trajectory upward. And I believe that if you look at the long arc of history, you see that we continue to make steps forward. We take steps backward, often in reaction to a step forward, but I believe that the arc of history is forever upward.
I'll just, if I can tell you two quick stories, and then thank you for having us. Martin Luther King, at 39 years of age, comes to Memphis in April of 1968 to speak to the sanitation workers. And he delivers a speech. And that speech has a couple of parts to it. And the first part is theological. He says to the audience that if the Lord said, Martin, I'll take you to any time and place, where shall we go? And Dr. King says, I want to go to Egypt. I want to see God's people delivered from Pharaoh's oppression. And then he said he wanted to go on to ancient Greece and see Aristotle, but he would keep moving to ancient Rome. But he said he'd keep on moving still back to that moment in time, because unless he lived in that time, his time, our time, he wouldn't have been in Selma. He wouldn't have been in Birmingham. And he then talks about the personal. And he says, longevity has its purpose. I want to live a long life. I grew up as a kid looking up at Dr. King on a television screen, but I look at him now from the vantage point of 54 years myself as he was a young man. And he says, I want to grow old. But he says, none of that matters now, because he saw something. He said he was to the mountaintop. And what he saw from the mountaintop was a fulfillment of something in Scripture that John Winthrop talked about as the pilgrims came into Providence Harbor, the city upon a hill, that John Kennedy talked about, that Ronald Reagan talked about. And that's what King sees on the mountaintop. And like all prophets, he does not tell us when. There is incomplete information. And so we have to understand that we're getting to the mountaintop with struggle. And there is struggle ahead. And so the struggle that we talked about starting out tonight on this, the 250th anniversary of Bunker Hill, as we celebrate 2 days ago Washington taking command of an army of farmers, 4 companies of men, a continental army made up of all of the colonies, that by July 4th, 1776, as independence is declared, we're in big trouble within months. And the enlistment of the soldiers is up on New Year's. The army has been defeated, chased across New Jersey. Washington brings it in December across the Delaware River into a camp in Pennsylvania. And the men have low morale, and they are defeated. Washington writes as such to his brother, it is a disaster. And there's a young Scotsman named Thomas Paine, who is a writer and an agitator, and is the first person to come up with a brand, a name. He says we should call it the United States of America. And so in the camp, on the edge of Christmas, defeated, a letter arrives in the camp. And Washington reads the letter. And he immediately orders an assembly of the soldiers on the 23rd of December of the year 1776. And I want to read an excerpt of that letter. It says, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtained too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. And the Army heard those words, and 2 days later they crossed the Delaware and they took Trenton. And the United States of America lived to fight another day. And so, before I say goodnight to you all, there are only 700 million Americans who have ever lived. Half of all of us who have ever been are alive right now. And no matter where you came from and what year your ancestors got here, you are an inheritor of Lafayette's legacy, and Washington's, and Adams, and Jefferson, and Grant, and Lincoln, and Martin Luther King, and Frederick Douglass, this great mosaic made up of all of the people of the world, where every language still is spoken commonly every day, that's done more good, has fed more people, cured more people, liberated more people, clothed more people, invented more things, explored more places, led the world in science and discovery, that we will let it be burned to the ground by Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski and Donald Trump and his sons and his wife? Hell no. Hell no. So get involved. You can find me at The Warning on Substack. Please follow along, write every day, have something to say, but make sure you register to vote. If you're not, be engaged, get involved with candidates. You have to be good citizens, and you have to take time to get people involved, to stand up for your rights. Thank you very much.
So, thank you to Steve Schmidt. Thank you to Jay Johnson. Thank you to Carrie Shavat, who set tonight up. Have a good evening.
Thank you, guys. That's great. Thank you. You got me in, so. You should run for office.